There are many questions concerning the way one approaches a restoration project. When we talk about restoration, are we trying to return a building to its original state, trying to remove some of the accretions over time which have maybe covered over its original state or a state in which it was particularly beautiful? Or are we just trying to keep it so that it can survive and repairing it against wear and tear? Or are we making it functional for a particular purpose so that while it retains some of its traditional character, it also has new developments as part of it? These are not new questions. They go back to the very beginnings of historic conservation in Britain and the world more broadly. And in this short video, I want to talk about some of those origins, particularly in 19th century Britain, and how they have come to shape the conservation movement and the approaches to restoration in the future. And I kind of want to begin this by looking at a particular individual, a particular movement which gave rise to an emphasis upon restoration. And that was spearheaded by one of Britain's greatest architects, Augustus Pugin. Now, Pugin was in the early 19th century, and he was fascinated by Gothic architecture, that form of building which was inherent in the medieval era. Think of your great Gothic cathedral with its pointed spires rising from the ground up to the heavens, in some sense conveying the magnificent ambition and search for God at the heart of Christianity and of medieval kingdoms. Now, Augustus Pugin believed that there was great power in this architecture because it wasn't just a form of building, it was actually conveying the content of the medieval Christian worldview in a stone form, in a built form. And he believed that by recapturing that vital energy through such architecture, Britain could be elevated once again. And this is reflected in many of his works, not least the Houses of Parliament at Westminster, which we can see photographs of here. His ideas were echoed by another prominent thinker in the early to mid 19th century. That was John Ruskin. Ruskin was one of the foremost intellectuals of the period, having a profound impact upon not only artists and thinkers, but architects as well. And he was very clear that the Gothic mindset, which celebrated imagination, improvisation, taking nature in all of its aspects, providing the architect and builder with a sense of agency and freedom, was thoroughly Christian. And that in some sense, this was a Christian architecture, insofar as it reflected fundamental aspects of the faith in its principles of construction and form. With that in mind, he kind of convinced many people that a revival of the Gothic would be a good thing in Britain. But as we can see in the quotation here, he also emphasized the need to maintain and keep the treasures of the past. It's not just about building new buildings in a Gothic style, but actually those buildings which are of architectural significance, which have principles of beauty, whether they are Gothic or classical or another form of design, are worthy of us securing their survival. They are treasures which don't just belong to us, but belong to both our ancestors and our descendants. And so in some sense, we have a obligation or duty to pass on these buildings in a better state than we received them, to pass them on both physically, but also in terms of our understanding about those buildings too. Now, Ruskin and Pugin influenced many, many people within British architecture, and perhaps one of the most important figures was George Gilbert Scott. He was an architect working during this period, probably more from the mid to late Victorian 19th century. And he took forward the ideas of the Gothic revival, uh, the idea that Gothic architecture was an expression of a Christian spirit, and applied it further, because he said, well, it's not just about building new Gothic buildings. That is a good thing, and we should be doing it. But there is also a case for churches, restoring churches around the country. The reason for this is that they are the last remnants and most prominent remnant of that old Christian culture. They are the art of that period, just as the temples of the Hindus are the art of their religion, and the mosques of the Muslims reflect something of their religion, of the worldview, of the mindset, of the spirit which infuses that religion. So too, the church reflects something of British Christianity. The British churches do. And to let them fall into disrepair and decay would be to lose something vital, a treasure trove of that very powerful and dynamic spirit which gave rise to these buildings, whether they be small parish churches to mighty cathedrals. And so there is a real value in retaining these treasures, not least just for the architectural and intellectual interest in them, that they could be studied by students of history, but also because in their stone, they have a kind of living, tantalizing power which still affects us to this day. And as Scott and Ruskin and Pugin, all Christians themselves, they kind of saw this as these buildings as in some ways having an evangelizing role. They could suffuse society with those Christian values that they were built by. Scott saw the need for making his case, and he delivered speeches such as in 1848, a plea for restoring such churches. And he did so in the context of there being other approaches at this time. He defined the three approaches as conservative, destructionist, or eclectic. Now, the destructionist, as he presents it, is the person who says, well, actually, in the medieval period, uh, architects didn't worry too much about preserving old buildings. In fact, they often reworked them, they often changed them, and did irrevocable damage to what had gone before so that they could build something new. That at least was the kind of innovative and theoretical and genius approach to such architecture. The other side is the people who wanted to change buildings for the sake of practicality and expediency. These buildings are old and not suitable necessarily for the 19th century or the modern world. They're not comfortable, they're cold, they're dreary, they need to be updated for a modern audience. And such arguments are still made today. Scott, and perhaps there is a third category here, which Scott doesn't directly address in the speech that I'm referring to. But there was during this period several landowners who would knock down historic monuments to build buildings which they could make some profit out of, houses and work buildings and so on. This was certainly the case at the Avebury Stone Circle, where various landowners were threatening to dig up the stones to build housing on it. Scott says, no, this is a terrible thing to do. The destructionist is going to wipe away the heritage, this great Christian art that is a treasure trove for the nation and a catalyst for revitalization, both in architecture but also in society more broadly. And as such, we should be taking a conservative stance on our restoration work. We should be wanting to retain as much as possible of the old building in its traditional state. Now, that has a kind of elastic meaning here for Scott. As you may have been seeing in this quotation, he believed that the thing, I think a good way to put it is, for him, the key is to retain that Gothic architecture at its highest and most sublime form in whatever building one finds it. And so, even if there was an edition, let's say in the 1700s, of a nice uh, Baroque monument or decoration, or perhaps in the Tudor period there was another little alteration to the building and its layout. If these things in some way undermine the beauty and the highest peak of this building, then we should do away with them so that we can restore fully the great beauty of the Gothic architecture in play. We may need to destroy certain things so that the whole can be restored to what it once was as a beautiful place. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily returning to its origin, although in Scott's view, elements of the origin of a building should always be retained within it. Rather, you may want to kind of move to a later date when, perhaps with further additions, it really became sublime, that it really reached its fullness in Gothic architecture. It's only those things which distort or distract from it we should also remove in the process. He saw this as quite a conservative response, that we're trying to conserve the real beauty in this building and purge anything which was a potential eyesore or obstacle to that beauty, to that high point. So he's really interested in retaining the kind of architecture here. And this was manifested in many of his works, many of the places that he was commissioned to be an architect for, many parish churches. The one in particular that is of note is Tewkesbury Abbey. Tewkesbury Abbey. He had been actually commissioned to do this for several years, but in 1877 there was a renewed appeal to raise funds to do some of the restoration work. And this was a major affair. It had several important members of the aristocracy in attendance, and they were looking to try and raise £4,000, which at that time was a really significant amount of money. At that event, Scott presented new plans for the restoration work. He had already said very early in the project that the exterior of Tewkesbury Abbey didn't need much attention. It was in remarkably good condition. But the interior, in his view, had been remodeled in various ways, which didn't allow it to be fully flourishing as an example of Gothic architecture. So he tried to remodel it, and we can see on the left-hand side his drawing or his plan of what he would do to the building if they raised the funds. And you can see that it is quite a magnificent, beautiful building, which on the right-hand side in a more recent photograph is certainly the case. But this would have resulted in major, extensive changes to the interior of the building. It wasn't just leaving it, and it wasn't just repairing it. It was fundamentally remodeling it so that it would look more like what it used to as a historic building than it had become. And this really was quite controversial. This wasn't something which many people, or everybody, I should say, was affirmative of. There were some who were quite irate by this design. Enter William Morris. Now, William Morris was a key member of the later pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, or at least he was associated with them. He was heavily influenced by figures like Rossetti, and with his colleague and friend Edward Burne-Jones, he would go on to kind of pioneer the arts and crafts movement, which was thoroughly influenced by John Ruskin, taking on this very deep love of a pre-industrial England. He was trying to recover something of what it was like to be a medieval craftsman, both in his method and in his design. And he was not only interested in kind of visual art and painting, tapestry, stained glass windows. He also developed furniture for sale, really beautiful handcrafted furniture, and he was something of a literary figure too, capturing, translating myths like the Nibelungenlied into English, writing his own fairy stories. So this was a man who had a deep conviction of trying to preserve and transmit the old world into the new. So he's coming from that background already, a man who takes history and heritage seriously, who believes that it is a vital source for culture in the present, that it is worthwhile to restore and renew interest in the things prior to the Victorian industrial age, with its money men and material degradation into consumption. No, there are higher things which are worthy of attention. So you might think that much of what uh, Gilbert Scott is doing would appeal to Morris, because Scott thinks that by restoring these buildings in to a kind of quintessential moment where they are at their highest point of Christian art, he is saving a vital connection with the past for the present and future. Isn't that what Morris is trying to do when he's translating a work of Norse mythology, when he's writing Arthurian poems? Well, Morris was strongly against what Scott was doing, and so much so he wrote a vicious letter, really lambasting the restoration efforts, if it could be called that, of Gilbert Scott. And as you can see in the quotation on this screen. And he kind of concluded this letter with the call for a society that would not be so much for restoration, or it would be against restoration in the sense of restoring a building to some quintessential moment or original state, but rather to preserve buildings, to keep them secure, to secure their future, to make sure that they don't fall down, and thus leave them alone afterwards. He and his colleague Philip Webb would go on then to found the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. And at their first meeting, they had quite a roll call. Among their members were Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin, William Holman Hunt, Edward Burne-Jones, and a raft of other intellectuals, artists, and politicians. So this was a society with heavy weight and heft going up against Gilbert Scott. And Webb and Morris wrote a manifesto as part of the founding of the society. And they make several arguments about why someone like Scott's work cannot be the case, that it just can't be successful. The first thing they raise is, okay, Scott thinks that we should restore these buildings to a point where they most fully exemplify the Christian art, the Gothic. But the question is, who is he to judge this? He himself was critical of those architects who follow their whims and fancies and force a building to follow a particular style. But here we've got Scott, who has to make a judgment call on when the best form of Gothic is. Beyond that, there is the problem that buildings are not just static realities. They exist in time. There is no quintessential aspect of the building per se, but rather a history to a building, which goes through multiple stages. And at each stage, men and women convey their worldview, convey their spirit through the way they build and add to that building over time, so that each development or accretion isn't just some shallow, lifeless add-on, but actually is an expression, a living expression of those different people in their different times and places. So to remove these things isn't, and when we're talking about removal, it's like moving the choir stalls across to another area, changing the arches on doors, pretty fundamental things. It's not just moving furniture around. this is fundamental changes to the building, you're actually kind of robbing it of its vitality, because you're wanting to ossify it, to keep it static in one moment and no other. Whereas actually it is a living building with an ongoing history, and through time has had a series of changes and developments. So you're arresting it, you're preventing it from fully breathing, as it were. And as a consequence, you're actually robbing the very people you're saying you're trying to help. You're robbing those who want to study and understand and appreciate a building for all of itself. A very Gothic kind of approach. Not just the good, not just the bad, but everything which makes the history of that building. Indeed, one might go further, and this isn't actually in Morris's argument, but I think you could derive it from their point of view, that this kind of idea that there is a perfect essence of this building is a very anti-Gothic attitude. The Gothic attitude admits for imperfection, admits for the place of improvisation. And that's because there was a sense of fallibility in the architect. He can never achieve the perfect building. To do so, he would either have to make it so simple that it, isn't very complex, or and he would have to kind of reduce his own agency and flair to fit in with that. Or even if he tries for a more complex design, it's just going to fail. There'll always be a mistake. There'll always be some mistake. So rather than say, okay, we can have no flaws in this building, the Gothic architect says, I'm going to make mistakes, but that I'm not going to let that fear overcome my creativity. In fact, it gives a license, a freedom to try new things, to make things which aren't symmetrical, but actually can have a beauty of their own. That I will follow my impulse rather than stick to a rigid dogma of perfection. And this is how buildings then grow organically through time, that people feel, okay, I'm going to add something here, I'm going to add something there. And even if it's not the most beautiful, perfect thing, it still reflects that Gothic spirit of ingenuity and embracing a kind of, a growing, living reality. The perfect idea kills that, because it has to be 100% without mistake. It's a static reality. You can't admit for new additions to it, because you're then undermining the perfection. And so I feel that Scott's view could be presented as actually following a more classical approach to architecture in trying to find an ideal state for a building. But even if we put that aside, the fundamental problem that Scott's got, and this is something Morris and Webb really hit on, is, okay, well, you want to try and rebuild these buildings because you believe that they are a manifestation in stone of the spirit of the Christian medieval world. But you yourself are not a medieval Christian. You do not share their spirit, their ideas, their worldview. You may think you do. You may think as a Christian you share those fundamental convictions, but actually you are a 19th century Christian. You have a different history. You have a different set of ideas. Your politics and the world you live in is completely different. The idea of the kind of mechanical machine powered by steam was not a reality for somebody in the 13th century. Is that you live in a world with steam trains that can zoom you around the country much faster than anyone in the medieval period could travel. You do not share their same spirit. And so how can you recreate or reconstruct an architectural style which, if you yourself admit, is a manifestation of a certain spirit that you do not share the same spirit of? in a way, it would be, it's an inauthentic. It will merely appear to the same. It would not have that essence. But even as such, the appearance will not be quite right. There'll be just something off about it because it doesn't have that organic spirit underpinning it. And so for Morris Webb and the society here, the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, restoration, if that word is to be used, should not be along the lines of what Scott was trying to do, which we might call a reconstruction of a building. Rather, it should just be to protect the building, to make sure that it is durable, that any things which are breaking should be fixed, but otherwise leave it alone. At the same time, if somebody wants to change something for expediency, for practical reasons, for utilitarian reasons, these should also be rejected. No, if you want to have a more comfortable space to have your Bible meeting, you go and build a new building. You don't change this wonderful historic place. If you want a building which can do other things or have new functions, you don't change the church. You certainly don't knock down part of it. You go and build a new building for that purpose. This church remains for its function as a place of worship and is sustained as an object of reverence and appreciation and a source of knowledge of the past and the art it produced. I think that there are some key kind of debates here then within this topic of the origins of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, which was one of the first societies in the world to be dedicated for the preservation of the buildings of a people, particularly in England and Britain. The first kind of point here is that almost everyone in this debate agrees that the restoration of churches is an act of preserving Christian culture. They're not just important because they're old buildings. Their style conveys something of the culture which made them. They thus have an architectural and historic significance, and their destruction and decay removes a bond, a witness, a sign, a relic, a remnant of that ancient past. To knock down a building isn't just to knock down stone, it's to obliterate the culture or the vision which gave birth to that building. And so all of these people agree that it has that consequence. There is, though, an interesting kind of further point, which many of these people seem to believe, that if certain architectural styles are tied to certain worldviews, then their presence in public life is an advance of those worldviews. It pushes them out into our daily lives and makes us more fully aware of them. They could even bleed into us in some way. So the presence of a church or a mosque or a building which is bland or a brutalist building, these are not just neutral architectural styles. They actually advance positions, ideologies, values in some way or another. And so their consideration can be a force for good, a force for evil. It can have positive and negative effects upon us and our communities. And thus architecture has a moral value, perhaps even a teleological value, which should be considered when thinking about how to go about any building, never mind a reconstruction or restoration. This leads to the second point then. As we've been discussing, restoration has different meanings and different people understand different things by it. At least in this debate, George Gilbert Scott is taking restoration to mean a reconstruction of a building to appear like it did at a certain point of time. And that allows you then to remove certain aspects of the building. As I was saying before, for him, the thing to preserve really is Christian art or Gothic architecture. In a way, the building is a vehicle for that. So he's quite willing to change the building to make sure that it is restoring that Gothic architecture, at least in its most pristine form. Whereas for Morris and his allies, the key is actually the building itself, not a particular style of architecture. Yes, the style of architecture is interesting because it is something we can study and learn from and incorporate into our own work, but actually the building and its life and its history are also valuable. And actually its blending of architecture from different times is in itself an interesting conversation worthy to preserve. And so for him, it's not about preserving one architectural style, it's actually about preserving the building for its own sake. And so he is the ultimate minimalist in restoration. Indeed, he kind of shies away from restoration, shuns the word. He wants to say, no, all we're doing is preserving a building. We will do the minimal amount of work to repair it, but otherwise we're not touching it. And that's quite a stark position, but I think that it needs a little bit of qualification, because what we can see on the right-hand side here is a stained glass window from Malmesbury Abbey, one of the oldest abbeys in the whole of England. And this was designed by Edward Burne-Jones. And Morrison and Burne-Jones designed several stained glass windows for churches, and they did art for many historic places. So you suddenly get a question, okay, he's not afraid to install beautiful artworks, albeit in keeping with older architectural styles, but certainly they're not identical. Anyone who's seen a Burne-Jones stained glass window, or painting for that matter, can see that, yes, he's trying to bring in elements of the medieval and Gothic, but it's very much in his own style. He's not a mere imitator. It's got his imprint upon it. He's adding something new to the artwork, to the architecture. So there might be a case in saying, well, actually, both these men are willing to continue the history of these buildings by adding, where appropriate, beautiful artwork to elevate those historic churches. So there might be an argument here about, actually, well, when he says we're just to preserve these places, that doesn't mean we don't do anything with them. Indeed, rather, we preserve them as buildings with a living history, and we contribute to that living history in tasteful ways which complement and elevate what's already there. But we're not going in and changing everything. We're just trying to build upon the foundations of what's before. So maybe there's a kind of tenuation there. I think later conservationists will take this idea further and say, actually, that is the heart of restoration. It's not just mere preservation of a building. It's actually working to adapt it in ways which strengthen and make it more beautiful, elevate its significance in changing situations and circumstances. That's the heart of conservation. The third point here is about the reactive character of the conservation movement in this period. As you could see at the beginning, what Gilbert Scott is reacting to is certain attitudes within the Church of England and Victorian society, which say it's okay to destroy large parts of architecture, either because you want to be innovative and imaginative and follow new designs for your churches, or because of expediency, because it's practical, because there's a more comfortable way of having a building than what we've currently got. So he's reacting against these two pressures and saying, no, we cannot do either of these. We can't just destroy these beautiful buildings. And actually, here's why we should protect them. And we should be protecting them not just in terms of preserving them as they are, but actually restoring them to something more like they were before. So his arguments, while we may not be fully convinced on the idea that we should always reconstruct, The emphasis upon reconstruction is in response to these very naked attempts to say, actually, no, we should be quite willing to destroy the historical architectural essence of these buildings. Then Morris himself is a reaction to Scott. He wants to say, actually, you've gone too far in the other, but this way now. This isn't the right way to do restoration. You're making fundamental alterations in the building, and this cannot go on. This is damaging the building and its treasures that it's offering us. So he too is reacting in this process, and I think that's worthy of thinking about when today we're going about restoration work, that there will be certain pressures and trends within architecture and broader society which we'll be tempted to respond to in our architectural work, say with the restoration of a church or a castle, as we're trying to do. The temptation then is to strongly go in one direction against a position that you might find negative. But the challenge is to actually see, well, okay, that one thing is a problem, but I have to have a measured approach and response. I can't just react fully the other way, because there'll be other pressures and other things which are then caused by taking a certain decision. Taking a more proactive and a reasoned approach might be a way to navigate the many pitfalls that are going on here. It's also worth saying as well that actually acknowledging that whatever decision you make may be open to criticism from one point of view, even if you can't see it at the beginning. Like Scott really couldn't see it at the beginning, at why someone like Morris would oppose him in 1877. It allows you to think, okay, maybe there is something I can attenuate for future restoration and architectural work. So that's a little overview of the beginnings of the conservation movement and the role of restoration within British history and society. I think it shows that many of the issues that we face today have been going for over a century, and that the origins of what we're doing now are not something that are to be taken for granted. It took people to respond to a particular set of situations and circumstances in the 19th century, brought on by industrialization and changes in ideology and religion, which led them to really see the value of the historic environment, of castles and churches and our heritage in stone. And so that is the legacy which very much is on us today. We are standing as the descendants of people like Gilbert Scott and William Morris, and it's on us to carry on the fight, to preserve, to restore, perhaps even reconstruct some of these magnificent buildings. Thank you for watching this Pendragon Foundation video. If you would like to support our work, please consider donating or volunteering or sharing our content. Anything you can do to help is really very much appreciated. Thank you very much. Goodbye for now.